webinar Human Rights in Algeria, Challenges and Perspective in Observance of the International Human Rights Day 2024. My name is Imène Hmili and I am honored to be your moderator for today's event. To start, I'd like to give you a little introduction for this webinar, which is organized to commemorate International Human Rights Day and shed light on the human rights landscape in Algeria. We will discuss challenges faced, including the shrinking space, legislative measures used to suppress dissent, and targeting of legal professionals. Our esteemed panelists also will share their perspectives on how collectively we can advocate for positive change. So I'll start by introducing our esteemed speakers for today's discussion. First, we have Rachid Aouine, Director and Founder of SHOAA for Human Rights. Second, we'll have Nadège Lahmer from Amnesty International. Then we have Estelle Allemann from MENA Rights Group. And finally, Yassin Osman from the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. We will begin with a welcoming word and general introduction of the human rights situation in Algeria from Mr. Rachid Aouine. Rachid, the floor is yours.
تحية طيبة للجميع. أشكر جميع الحضور من متحدثين ومشاركين. اليوم هو ديسمبر 2019، نحتفل جميعا باليوم العالمي لحقوق الإنسان، وفي ذكراه 76 لاعتماد الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان، اليوم الذي يصادف 10 من ديسمبر من كل سنة. تأتي هذه الذكرى في هذه السنة في جو من الإحباط يشعر به الناس بسبب تقاعس الحكومات والمؤسسات في حماية حقوق الإنسان اتجاه ما يشهده العالم من انتهاكات جسيمة لحقوق الإنسان. في الجزائر التي صادقت على الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان الذي يضمن تحقيق الحرية والكرامة والمساواة في الحقوق، يتعرض المواطنون لاعتداءات مستمرة، خاصة خلال السنوات الأخيرة التي تلت انطلاق الحراك الشعبي السلمي المطالب بالحرية. خلال السنوات الأخيرة التي تلت انطلاق الحراك الشعبي والمطالب بالحرية والديمقراطية، حيث تشهد الجزائر انتهاكات جسيمة ترتكبها السلطات الجزائرية تجاه الحق في حرية التعبير والتجمع السلمي، فضلا عن الاعتقالات التعسفية التي تطال الناشطين والمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان والصحفيين وكذلك المعارضين السياسيين، لا سيما الانتهاكات التي يتم تنفيذها تحت ستار مكافحة الإرهاب. نحن في منظمة شعاع لحقوق الإنسان بمناسبة الذكرى 76 لليوم العالمي لحقوق الإنسان، وفي ظل هذه الكبرى التي تواجهنا أمام حالة حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر، نستذكر معا عملنا الدؤوب في رصد وتوثيق الانتهاكات الجسيمة لحقوق الإنسان في الجزائر، ونستذكر نضالنا من أجل الدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان وإسماع صوت الأفراد الذين يعملون من أجل حقوقهم وحرياتهم، والعمل على ربط حركة حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر بالمجتمع الدولي. بهذه المناسبة مرة ثانية، وأمام ما نشهده من انتهاكات صارخة لمبادئ الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان من طرف السلطات الجزائرية، نؤكد في هذه المناسبة باستمرار نضالنا من أجل تعزيز حقوق الإنسان وتحقيق العدالة والحرية والمساواة في الجزائر. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Rachid, for this insightful overview and for setting the stage for our discussion. Next, we'll have Nadège Lahmer from Amnesty International, who will speak about the shrinking civic space in Algeria. Nadège, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Speak in English. Please let me know if you test.
Yes, of course.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, SHOAA, for the invitation. I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk more about Algeria, especially on Human Rights Day. Today, I will focus on the closure of civic space in Algeria, specifically showing the latest developments, notably the continued crackdown on freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. And I will refer to the latest research published by Amnesty International in September that looks at the latest developments this year and also a little bit last year. So I can start by mentioning, of course, we know freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association is protected under international law, under several conventions ratified by Algeria. But I would also like to mention Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that recognizes and protects the rights of everyone to take part in of public affairs. And the UN Human Rights Committee established that in order to ensure the full enjoyment of this right, the free communication of information and ideas about public and political issues is essential. So this implies a free press. This requires the full enjoyment and respect of the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association, which essentially constitute civic space. So Amnesty International has previously documented the shutting down of civic space and the silencing of peaceful dissent in Algeria, whether inside Algeria or transnationally. So to summarize, we talked about the misuse of terrorism charges. We talked also about the arbitrary suspension of political parties, the dissolution of civil society and human rights organizations, the dissolution of media outlets. So this is kind of the background. We should also mention that in his visit to Algeria, in his report on the visit, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association, he said clearly that the criminalization of civil society work in Algeria had, I quote, a chilling effect and has created a climate of fear, resulting in the severe shrinking of civic space. So that's also an important point. So in terms of the latest kind of developments that we documented, overall, it is not, unfortunately, it is not a radical change. We continue to see a shutting down and closure of civic space through a brutal crackdown on fundamental rights. So I will give a bit of an overview of the situation for freedom of association, specifically opposition political parties. Then I will talk also a little bit about freedom of peaceful assembly and association for civil society organization and activists, and other people who have just tried to organize, for example, cultural events. I will then move on to freedom of expression, talking about recent legislative amendments. And I will mention some violations in practice, like restrictions of movement of journalists, for example. So I will start with the restrictions against opposition political parties. So authorities basically have continued to use repressive legislation to restrict the work of opposition political parties and to prosecute political activists in relation to the exercise of their human rights. So we already saw in 2022, 2023, we saw that authorities suspended 2 political parties and they attempted to suspend a third one. We also see that they have used like 2 kind of important laws, Law 1204 on political parties and Law 9119 on public meetings and demonstrations. Without going into too much detail, both of these laws are problematic. They do not meet international standards and they do not let organizations fully exercise their right to peaceful assembly and association. So in terms of recent development, we see that in September 2023, using these laws, authorities arbitrarily prevented the summer camp of a party called the Rally for Culture and Democracy, the RCD. In November 2023, they also prevented another party, the Union for Change and Progress, from organizing a party conference. Again, more recently, in June 2024, the authorities also similarly prevented the RCD, the Rally for Culture and Democracy, from holding a conference before the elections in a theater in Batna in June 2024. Without adequately justifying it and giving them time to appeal the refusal. Now moving on from like the organization of events, we also see arrests of political activists. So before the election, we saw on 20 August the arrest of at least 60 political activists, majority of them leaders or members of the RCD, as they were traveling for the commemoration of a historic event. A large police force basically prevented the activists from entering the city, the town, and arrested them in the morning, and of course integrated them and didn't let them inform their lawyers or relatives. So this was kind of a major roundup of arrests. Other example, we also saw in the lead up to the election, the arrest of a political activist and member of the democratic and social movement, Yassin Mkiresh. He was arrested on 6th August, solely in relation to Facebook publications that are protected under the right to freedom of expression. So they arrested him and searched his house without a warrant, and he was placed in pretrial detention for publishing information likely to cause discrimination and inciting to an armed gathering. I can also mention the issue of the arbitrary detention of political figure Karim Tabou on 19 August. He was detained for most of the day and then brought in front of an investigative judge who expanded the terms of the judicial supervision that he was already subjected to. And this supervision now includes a ban on publications, media interventions, and political activity, which is obviously problematic. And this was also, the same thing was also done to other political activists. So this very restrictive and abusive terms of the judicial supervision. So we see here the really intent from the authorities to restrict the activity of political activists, their freedom of expression, and their even freedom to associate. Now moving on to a wider look at the right to peaceful assembly and association for civil society organization, activists, and other people. We see that in Algeria, we have the problematic law 1206 on association, which has been used to arbitrarily dissolve civil society and human rights organization using trumped up motives. We see that one of these organizations was the Youth Action Rally, or RAJ. We see that the president of RAJ, Abdelwahab Farsawi, on 1st April this year, he was again summoned for questioning. Authorities seized his phone, asked him about recent Facebook posts and media interventions. So this shows the continued kind of surveillance and control of their activities and the fear that continues to be maintained on civil society activists. Then other example also, we documented the obstruction of a book signing event on 29 of June, and also 2 human rights events in February and March this year, which again illustrates the authorities' intolerance for peaceful gathering. So we talk about the 2 events organized by Algerian organization SOS Disappeared in February and March. They tried to organize 2 human rights events on their premises, and basically they were prevented by a large police force who came and turned away people and blocked the entrance without any justification. Then we also documented a book signing event on 29 June, which was interrupted by the police, who also arrested the people who were attending the event, including the book's writer and editor and a few journalists, and questioned them for several hours about why they were attending it. So we see this continued interference with freedom of peaceful assembly. I will also mention that this is also the case for like peaceful gathering organized kind of more or less spontaneously by activists. For example, on 25 of June, police arrested 3 activists who just gathered peacefully and were trying to commemorate on the grave of a renowned Kabyle singer Lounes Metoub on the anniversary of his killing. And among them was activist Mira Moknesh, who is now detained for terrorism charges. So this is another example. Now going from like political activists to freedom of assembly, freedom of association, we can also move on to freedom of expression. Here I will talk a bit about recent development, important development on the legislative front. Although I believe I will not try to not go into too much detail because I believe Estelle will also cover a little bit of that. So I just want to mention in 2023, Algerian authorities adopted a set of media laws. So in August and December 2023, there were 3 media laws, a law relating to information, a law related to written electronic press, and a law relating to audiovisual activity. And basically, this set of law reinforced again the repressive legal framework for media activities. They contain a lot of vague and unjustified requirements on media work, like, for example, a restrictive definition of what is a journalist, a lack of safeguards for the independence of the regulatory bodies. Also, a lot of powers in the hand of the Ministry of the Communication. So a lot of issues that I can get into later if needed, but overall this set of laws really represented another setback for freedom of the press in the country. And then this year, authorities added the amendment to the penal code through law 24006 on 28th of April. So amended the penal code, and again, it was another setback for freedom of expression. The law added a plethora of really a lot of really broad and vague amendments and new provisions, which basically further like add new provisions that criminalize acts protected under freedom of expression that should be protected under freedom of expression. And this is likely to promote, again, self-censorship and prevent a free and open discourse that should be guaranteed in a free civic space. So just mentioning a few provisions without going into too much details, but for example, the law adds provision related to expands the scope, of provision related to the offense of demoralization of the army or harming the national interest. It also introduces prison sentences and other penalty for contempt against the symbols of the National Liberation Revolution or harming the image of the security services. And it also increases the penalty for, or it introduces a new penalty of 5 years of prison for anyone who facilitates or attempts to facilitate directly or indirectly the irregular exits of anyone from the territory. So very problematic provisions added. I will also, of course, refer to an important issue in Algeria is the overly broad definition of terrorism under Article 87 bis of the Penal Code, but I think Estelle will cover this in her intervention. I will just add that a new law in February 2023, specifically amendments to the legislation on the financing of terrorism, have further reinforced this overly broad legislation, counterterrorism legislation, and the risk of its misuse. So in this regard, the authorities have continued to use vaguely worded and baseless terrorism charges to crack down on peaceful dissent. And I can just mention quickly one example. For example, Hirak activist and poet Mohammed Tajadid was arrested in January of this year, and he spent close to 11 months in detention, pretrial detention. For under terrorism charges, and I just wanted to mention this case because one of the bases for terrorism charges is his use of Hirak protest slogans and his expression of support for political change. And in the prosecution considered that this constituted support for terrorism. So I thought that was important to highlight. And I will finish just by mentioning also a few, like what we documented related to the recent arrests and also restrictions on the right to freedom of amendment of several journalists. So in Algeria, of course, we have the issue of arbitrary travel bans for a range of people, including lawyers, activists, human rights defenders. But I wanted to mention here the cases of some journalists in relation to freedom of expression. So, for example, we have journalist Marzouk Touati, who is under an arbitrary travel ban. Basically, authorities have refused to give him a new passport since October 2019, and there's been also an open-ended travel ban against him since November 2022 without justification. Similar thing for journalist Mustafa Benjema. He had a travel ban maintained against him since November 2019. Based on an investigation that was closed, but in spite of this, the authorities are not allowing him to travel. I will also mention what happened with Algerian journalist Farid Elilat on 13 April of this year. So Farid lives in France, and he was basically prevented from entering Algeria, and he was forcibly returned to France. He was detained for an evening by the airport police, who searched his phone and his computer without a warrant, and they questioned him at length about his work and his publication. And then they escorted him in the morning. They escorted him back to the plane going back to Paris. So this is also an important development, further highlighting Algerian authorities' continued intolerance to any kind of critical publication, to the extent that they would prevent someone from entering the country arbitrarily. I will conclude just by reiterating that Amnesty International continues to highlight these developments and urges the Algerian authorities to immediately release all those arrested solely for peacefully exercising their human rights, and to ensure the rights of everyone to exercise their freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. We see that the civic space continues to be under threat in Algeria, that Algerian authorities continue to show either through changes to the legislation or through developments in their practices. They continue to show their intolerance towards peaceful dissent, and peaceful criticism, and that is highly concerning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadège, for highlighting the alarming challenges related to civic space in Algeria. Our next speaker is Estelle Allemann from MENA Rights Group, who will talk about the legislative framework being used to stifle dissent. Estelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, SHOAA, for organizing this event and for inviting MENA Rights Group. In the next 15 minutes, I will try to give an overview of the legal framework used by Algerian authorities to actively stifle opposition and dissent. Some of these... If
you allow me, Estelle, I'm sorry to... I want to remind everyone that there is instant interpretation in Arabic, French, and English. فما ترجمة فورية للغة العربية، الفرنسية والإنجليزية باش توفر لكم متابعة جيدة للويبينار. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so as I was saying, some of the provisions Nadège has already touched upon, but I will try to dive into it some more. So the crackdown on civic space has intensified in Algeria, and especially since the Hirak movement, which began in 2019. And since then, Algeria has introduced and amended numerous laws specifically targeting peaceful activists, human rights defenders, and journalists. According to human rights defender Zaki Hanash's most recent counts, there are over 200 prisoners of conscience in Algeria. Such a number doesn't happen by chance. It's the result of a deliberate, organized legal framework which is aimed at silencing peaceful activism. And that's exactly what we see today. And maybe it's important to kind of start by putting it into a context and understanding where these laws come from. So back in 2020, Algeria has amended its constitution, which was presented as a response to the demands of the Hirak movements. But instead of addressing the movement's calls for change, the legal framework in Algeria only became more repressive since then. And I'm going to quickly touch upon fundamental freedoms. Yeah, regarding freedom of expression, although the 2012 and the current information codes have decriminalized press offences, which is a very positive step. We can see that in the penal code still punishes non-violent speech offences such as offending, insulting, or defaming public officials and institutions, which means that de facto people are still being prosecuted solely for peacefully exercising their right to freedom of expression, which Nadège has touched upon as well before. And regarding the right to freedom of expression, Article 53 of the 2020 Constitution provides that the right to create association is guaranteed and exercised by simple declaration. However, the 2012 law on associations gives the authorities broad discretion to deny the registration if associations are deemed to be acting contrary to national constants and values, public order or morality, as well as suspend or dissolve those which interfere in internal affairs or attacks national sovereignty. And these laws also limit associations' ability to receive foreign funds, imposes heavy fines and criminal penalties for members or leaders of informal association, and fails to provide associations with an adequate remedy to appeal the rejection of their registration. And the law of associations has notably been served as a basis of the dissolution of RAJ, as Nadège has mentioned, the Youth Action Rally, Rassemblement Action Jeunesse, in October 2021, as well as the Algerian League for the Defense of Human Rights in late 2022. And so far, any attempt made by the League to challenge the dissolution has been rejected. Similarly, regarding the right to peaceful assembly, although Article 52 of the 2020 Constitution provides that freedom of assembly and peaceful demonstration are guaranteed and may be exercised by simple declaration, the law on public gathering and meetings contains a number of extremely restrictive provisions, which include prior authorization by the executive, compliance with VIE criteria such as national principles, public order, or public decency, and any gathering that doesn't go with these standards are considered as a non-gathering. And in June 2021, the United Nations Special Procedures have actually expressed their concerns as to massive arbitrary arrests of peaceful demonstrators, bans of demonstration, and excessive use of force, which was made possible through the law on public meetings and gatherings. So even though, the Constitution of 2020 was promising to grant more fundamental freedoms, it is quite clear that these promises were vain and that in practice, those freedoms are still as restraining, if not more than they were before. And this is even more clear with the amendments of the Penal Code in 2020 and 2024, which have introduced or amended a number of provisions which are detrimental to human rights in Algeria today. So in April 2020 and in early 2024, the Penal Code was amended. And in 2020, there have been a number of new amendments that were very detrimental, including an increased penalties for defamation. And also it introduced a highly problematic prohibition of dissemination of false information, stated in Article 96 bis. And again, the United Nations Special Procedures have shared a concern over Article 196 bis, saying that the vagueness of the terms used in this article constitutes a disproportionate restriction on freedom of expression, and it paves the way for legal action against journalists, peaceful activists, or anyone sharing critical content that authorities may later deem false, thereby restricting public debate. And this article has notably been used to prosecute journalist Yassin, who was in prison for almost 2 years. The Penal Code, as amended in 2020, has also introduced Article 95 bis, which sanctions with imprisonment of 5 to 7 years, so very heavy prison sentences, for the receipt of funds for the purpose of committing acts likely to undermine national unity, territorial integrity, and the fundamental interests of Algeria. And the penalty shall be doubled when the funds are received within the framework of an association, group, or organization. So this amendment provides the authorities with excessive power to prosecute civil society activists receiving foreign funding if they consider their activities to undermine national unity, which is, again, a very vague term which isn't judicially defined. This article was used to prosecute numerous activists, including journalist and human rights defender Mustafa Benjama and researcher and human rights defender Raouf Farah in 2023, who the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention have deemed their detentions as arbitrary. And additionally to these provisions I have mentioned, one of the key tools used by the Algerian authority to prosecute activists is their anti-terrorism legislation, which is enshrined in Article 87 bis of the Penal Code. So according to Zaki Hanash's data, over 80% of Algeria's prisoners of conscience were charged under Article 87 bis at some point or another. So that is a huge number. And the article defines terrorism in vague and overly broad terms, such as acts that target state security, national unity, or the stability and normal functioning of institutions. The problem is that these terms are left to the discretion of Algerian authorities and judges, enabling abuse. In June 2021, Article 87 bis was amended to further expand its definition of terrorism and to establish a national list of persons and entities. And a person can be listed even in the absence of a final judgment, questioning the principle of presumption of innocence. This amendment followed the High Security Council's decision to classify two political movements, the Rachid movement and the MAC, the Kabylie Self-Determination Movement, as terrorist entities. Several US special rapporteurs, including the one on counterterrorism and human rights, have expressed concerns over this definition of terrorism, which doesn't align with international standards. Under this broad definition, actually even the weekly Hirak demonstration that were taking place, who were peaceful in nature, could be labeled as acts of terrorism, because authorities could argue that they obstructed the functioning of institutions or occupied public spaces without authorization, which are both considered as terrorist acts under Article 87 bis. Since the 2021 amendments, terrorism charges have been leveled against an incredibly high number of peaceful activists. Prominent cases include journalists and human rights defenders like Jamila Loukil, Said Boudour, and Kadour Chouicha, who were acquitted in 2023 but are currently awaiting the appeal trial. Environmental activist Mohamed Ghazmi was sentenced to 2 years in prison for glorification of terrorism. Trade unionist Ahmed Bounseri faced similar charges. Human rights defenders Zaki Hanash, Mohamed Tajadid were also charged under the terrorism legislation, and the list goes on and on. Not all of them ended up being condemned for terrorism charges, but they were still all charged on this basis. In April 2024, Article 87 bis was amended again, while failing to address the concerns raised by civil society and international organizations. And it's important to note that even though Algeria's counterterrorism legislation is flawed by enormous human rights violations, Algeria is currently a member of the UN Counterterrorism Center Board and was appointed the chair of the UN Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, which is extremely worrisome. And in addition to these laws, the Algerian authorities have increasingly used arbitrary travel bans as a tool of reprisal, also called ISTN, Interdiction Sortie du Territoire National. These bans target political activists, trade unionists, human rights defenders, and even their family. And under Article 36 bis 1 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, a prosecutor can impose a travel ban if there are indications suggesting a person's potential involvement in a crime or offense. And these travel bans are initially valid for 3 months and can be renewable once. However, in cases involving terrorism or corruption, it can be extended indefinitely until the investigation concludes. And actually, the current draft of the Code of Criminal Procedure even proposes allowing travel bans to be renewed in case of terrorism, corruption, or offenses against state security, which isn't clearly defined. So that means that even more people could be able to face indefinite travel bans. And yeah, the problem is that this law doesn't require authorities to notify individuals of the travel ban, many only discover it at border crossings or during police summons. There is no formal document to appeal, leaving those affected without access to judicial remedy. This practice of travel ban blatantly violates Algeria's international obligations, as well as Algeria's 2020 constitution, which stipulates in its Article 49 that the right to enter or leave the national territory is guaranteed to every citizen, and that any restriction on this right may only be ordered for a limited duration by reasoned decision of the judicial authority. However, many activists have been under travel ban for years, including Mustafa Benjama, Merzouk Touati, and many others. And these travel bans are used massively by Algerian authorities. Like a MENA rights group, we have documented dozens of cases, and we are very aware that this only represents the tip of the iceberg, as many believe that speaking out might further the length of the travel ban. And I will finish on this, but I feel like a lot of times the impact of travel bans is underplayed. It should be noted that the impact on a person's life is really significant. Like some people are prevented from going back to the country they work at, to reunite with family members, with friends, to accept work opportunity, or just to travel to different country without knowing for how many months or years, because most individuals are not being updated on the status of their travel ban. So yeah, it deeply impacts someone's everyday life. And so to conclude, I will say that since 2019, Algeria has systematically amended its law to stifle dissent, creating a chilling effect across civil society. Hundreds of activists have been arbitrarily detained or prosecuted, and many more face travel bans, making it increasingly difficult for independent journalists, human rights defenders, and activists to continue their crucial work. But it should also be noted that even under these difficult conditions, human rights defenders and activists do continue their advocacy in Algeria, which has to be highlighted and which forces respect.
Thank you, Estelle, for this rich contribution and for shedding light on the legislative tools of suppression in Algeria. To conclude the panel, we welcome Yassin Osman from the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, who will address the targeting of lawyers in Algeria, in particular relation to the Hirak movement. Yassin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Imène, and thank you, Rachid, as well as to the participants and the panelists for this webinar and the opportunity to address the deeply concerning situation in Algeria. I'll try to speak a bit slower as well for the interpreters. As we mark International Human Rights Day today, we are reminded of the essential role lawyers play in defending human rights, ensuring access to justice, and upholding the rule of law. In Algeria, however, this role has been under sustained attack, undermining not only individual practitioners, but the foundations of justice, accountability, and the separation of powers. In my intervention, as Imène mentioned, I'd like to explore the targeting of lawyers in the midst of the Hirak movement, particularly through the introduction of legislation that prohibits several legitimate activities of lawyers, how it has led to a chilling effect of self-censorship, further dampening the voice of civil society, and how this has impacted not only the movement, but the functioning of the justice system itself. When we reflect on the Hirak movement, we see that it's a powerful expression of Algerians' demands for democratic reform, social justice, and human rights. And these values very much overlap with the mandate of lawyers, which in its essence is ensuring access to justice and legal representation. From the outset, lawyers have played quite a central role since the insemination of the movement. In July 2019, following the first wave of arrests against peaceful Hirak demonstrators, the Collective for the Defense of Hirak Detainees was formed as a coalition of lawyers to voluntarily defend those who had been arbitrarily prosecuted for their involvement in protests. At its inception, the Collective was comprised of nearly 200 lawyers. It covered almost all trials across the country for nearly 2 years in an effort to expose legal violations and the conviction of those prosecuted for their activities. In the conviction for those activities, as well as to demand respect for human rights and the rule of law. However, their involvement made them targets of state repression by the state. Lawyers became subject to the same patterns of harassment from authorities that they were fighting against, ranging from surveillance and obstruction to criminal prosecutions, arbitrary arrests, and imprisonment. This harassment has severely impacted their ability to serve the public and to discuss human rights openly, leading to a significant reduction in the number of lawyers involved in defending human rights. It's led to the effective criminalization of legitimate activities that the movement itself sought to end. The defense of fundamental freedoms and human rights became grounds for persecution, and it became a broader assault on dissent in Algeria. The way that this has been furthered is especially through the amendments to the legal framework within Algeria. We see how this has been misappropriated to suppress dissent and target legal professionals. Firstly, in June 2021, Ordinance number 21.8 amended Article 87 of the Penal Code, expanding the definition of terrorism to also include peaceful opposition and dissidents. This vague and overly broad provision has been used to effectively criminalize the legitimate activities of lawyers in defending Iraq detainees, which is also protected under the UN guidelines of lawyers, particularly when it comes to client representation, and for the state not to mislabel a lawyer for the cause of their clients. Similarly, and later on in the same year, in 2021, Ordinance number 21.9 imposed severe penalties for sharing information related to judicial investigations, including classified information, without providing a definition for what is classified. Again, these vague and overly broad laws undermine the principle of legal certainty, which is a cornerstone of the rule of law, by granting authorities wide discretion to interpret and apply the law. It violates Algeria's obligations under international law, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of assembly and association, and to a fair trial. It's also been mentioned by the UN, where UN experts, including the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and Freedom of Expression, where they've repeatedly raised concerns about these legislative measures that were introduced, not only the ones in 2021, but also the ones just before the election in September of this year. They have emphasized that such laws are incompatible with Algeria's international commitments and that they erode the independence of the judiciary. Following a country visit to Algeria in December 2023, Mary Lawler, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, noted that Article 87 of the Penal Code relating to acts of terrorism was one of the most frequently cited laws used to prosecute human rights defenders, including lawyers. So it stands to show that terrorism legislation is in fact being used to target civil society activists, human rights defenders. She also observed that there were 4 main patterns of violations used to target human rights defenders and to suppress their voices. And this includes ongoing judicial harassment, dissolution of key human rights organizations, limitation on freedom of movement, which includes travel bans, and the intimidation and including intimidation and surveillance to severely impact on the mental health of activists and human rights defenders and that of their families. In reality, it's created a chilling effect on the ability of lawyers to represent Iraq detainees and to sustain the movement. And this is out of fear of intimidation and reprisal. One could also extrapolate, when you look at the events since 2019, that these events, that the measures that have been adopted were a response by the authorities to the Iraq movement to essentially sustain a chilling effect and an environment of self-censorship, especially following the pandemic, which hampered the mobility and the momentum of the Iraq movement. When it comes to the targeting and attacks against lawyers in Algeria, we also see an alarming disregard for legal safeguards. Lawyers face arbitrary travel bans, asset freezes, and even suspension from practicing law. Many have been subject to disciplinary measures by bar associations themselves. So you have internal pressure coming on against lawyers from within their own bar associations, as well as pressure from state authorities, effectively silencing their advocacy for human rights and the rule of law. Access to detained clients has also been obstructed, and this is in violation of domestic and international legal standards. The ICCPR guarantees the right to adequate legal representation, but many Algerians find themselves unable to meet their clients or even know if they'll appear in court. Such practices deny detainees the right to a fair trial and erode trust in the judicial system, despite the legal reforms that have been propelled by the government since 2019. It further contradicts the UN Basic Principles on the role of lawyers, which affirms that lawyers must be able to perform their professional functions without intimidation, harassment, or interference. Specifically, Principles 16 and 18 underline the importance of their independence and the need for the state to protect lawyers from any form of coercion. And this is especially so when representing their clients. The harassment of lawyers also cannot be viewed in isolation, as Nadège and Estelle have mentioned. It's part of a broader pattern of repression against civil society in Algeria, which includes human rights defenders, journalists, and peaceful activists, lawyers. They've all faced escalating threats and intimidation since the movement began, and this is in response to it. UN experts have also highlighted the misuse of counterterrorism legislation to criminalize peaceful dissent and mislabel human rights defenders as terrorists. The Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights while countering terrorism has criticized Algeria in the past for employing laws that lack clarity and open the door to arbitrary applications. These measures threaten not only individuals' freedoms, but the very concepts of the rule of law, especially when it's been arbitrarily applied in the manner in which it's been in Algeria. It's also an important point to mention that this isn't something that's unique to Algeria, that this approach of using terrorism to target human rights defenders and dissidents, it's not something that's unique to Algeria. We've seen similar approaches in Egypt and in Turkey as well, where anti-terrorism legislation is used to target lawyers protecting human rights and protecting and representing their clients. In the case of Turkey, it's in fact gone all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, where even within the highest court of appeal within Turkey, where this was argued, and it was overruled by the court. The case then went to the European Court of Human Rights, where the court then ruled in the case of Yalçın Kaya versus Turkey, that everyday activities were being treated as though they're forming part of a terrorism group, and that the domestic courts in Turkey unjustifiably extended the reach of criminal law to ordinary applicants. And this is in clear violation of international law. So again, we see that in Turkey that there have been legitimate procedures that have been used by lawyers who have been complying with the law and representing their clients. And yet it's the same terrorism legislation that's used to criminalize them and put themselves in the same boat as their clients, and being charged with essentially the same charges as their clients. So in conclusion is to say, where do we go from here? Firstly, to address these challenges from a legal standpoint, it's essential for Algeria to take significant reforms. And this central to it is the repeal of ordinances number 21.8 and 21.9, and to provide clear definitions for what is being criminalized so that lawyers are able to adequately respond to these, and to revise the penal code to align with international human rights, especially when it comes to the vague definition of terrorism and secrecy, which is so often misused and misappropriated. And secondly, the independence of the judiciary must be restored and must be a central focus for reforms. This includes ensuring that bar associations operate free from state influence and that lawyers can practice without fear of reprisal and in accordance with legal procedures and safeguards. Transparent mechanisms must be established to investigate allegations of harassment or abuse against legal professionals. And visits by the UN Special Rapporteurs are highly encouraged, as it acts as a litmus test and provides a standard that you can then turn back to when you're moving forward to see if state recommendations have been applied and whether the violations are in line, or rather whether the violations have been improved in line with international law. And lastly, it's for the state to have genuine dialogue with civil society, that the approach that is being used now of essentially hindering, stifling the voice of civil society through these measures, through removing the lawyers that activists are using so that they can ensure that they have their rights exercised. Instead of targeting the lawyers, let's instead have an open and free dialogue to actually understand what the demands are and how to move towards making those a reality and towards making sure that international law is being complied with. Thank you.
Thank you, Yassin, for these insights about the targeting of human rights lawyers. And I want to thank all of our speakers for these powerful introductions. Now I open the floor for questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. If anyone has a question for one of our panelists, you are welcome to ask. لو كان عندكم سؤال الواحد من الضيوف متاعنا يمكن رفع الإيد متاعكم. Let's see. Any questions? I don't see any hand raised. Again, لو كان عندكم سؤال للمتكلمين يمكنكم رفع اليد. It doesn't seem that we have any questions so far. So I'll give the word to Rachid and I'll go back if anyone has a question. Rachid, the floor is yours.
نعم. فقط أنا أريد بعض الإضافة وعطفا على كلام المداخلات المتحدثين. طيب، هو كما هو معروف أنه من خلال منذ انطلاق الحراك سنة 2019 كانت الحركة الحقوقية كانت تختلف على السنوات السابقة، بحيث كان فيه اهتمام أكثر للدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان وحماية حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر، وهذا نتاج الوعي المتنامي خلال الحراك الشعبي المطالب بالحرية والديمقراطية. ثم رأينا أنه كيف كانت السلطات يعني أمعنت في انتهاكاتها الحقوقية وانتهاكاتها الصارخة في تفريغ الفضاء المدني من أجل كذلك انتهاك الحق في حرية التعبير، حرية التجمع والتكوين الجمعيات. لكن الطفرة ربما اللي ربما في خلال السنتين السابقتين كان في طفرة واضحة أو فيه تنامي الأصوات المدافعة عن حقوق الإنسان. لكن مع الأسف الشديد قبل سنة منذ اندلاع الحرب ونشوب الحرب في غزة كان هناك ربما التفاتة كبيرة من طرف المنظمات الحقوقية تجاه الوضع الحقوقي في غزة. لكن ومع الأسف الشديد يعني أمام تقاعس الهيئات، ربما لا أقول هيئات دولية وإنما تقاعس الحكومات ومسؤولية أصحاب المصلحة فيما يخص ملف حقوق الإنسان، كان هناك في إحباط اتجاه ربما المسؤولية تجاه توقيف الانتهاكات الحقوقية والإبادة التي شاهدناها في غزة. هذا كان له ربما أثر سلبي على نفسية ربما المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان أو كل الأصوات الحقوقية في الجزائر. وهذا باعتقادي أو في اعتقادي أنه نراه تحدي كبير أمام الوضعية الحقوقية في الجزائر من أجل ربما إعادة بعث نفس الدفاع عن الحقوق والحريات، وكذلك أنه ربما المنظمات الحقوقية الدولية وأصحاب المصلحة في حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر أن تكون لهم ربما تواصل مع الجميع وكل ضحايا الانتهاكات الحقوقية وبنفس المسافة، حتى ربما ترجع هناك ثقة كبيرة ما بين المؤسسات الحقوقية أو الجهات الدولية التي تعنى بحقوق الإنسان في الجزائر. لأنه كما قلت مع الأسف الشديد خلال هذه السنة الأخيرة، وكذلك ربما سبب آخر من الشيء الذي خلى ربما تراجع نوعا ما الاهتمام بحقوق الإنسان، ربما هناك بين قوسين بعض الانتقائية في التعامل مع الملفات الحقوقية. اليوم في الجزائر وفي الذكرى 76 للإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان، انتهاكات صارخة تمارسها السلطات الجزائرية. وكذلك اليوم نرى أنه في السجون ما لا يقل على أكثر من 200 معتقل رأي، مساجين سياسيين، فيهم صحفيين، فيهم مدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان، فيهم كثير من المواطنين فقط عبروا عن رأيهم أو عبروا عن امتعاضهم وعن ربما استيائهم من الوضع الاجتماعي أو من الوضع الاقتصادي أو من الوضع السياسي بشكل عام. هنا الآن ربما فيه مضربين عن الطعام، أكثر من 19 معتقل رأي مضرب عن الطعام لمدة تفوق الشهر، لكن مع الأسف الشديد هناك ربما تجاهل لصرخات هؤلاء الذين دخلوا في إضراب عن الطعام للاحتجاج عن ربما عن الاحتجاج عن اعتقالهم التعسفي، وكذلك تجاهل أو ربما تعطيل محاكمتهم محاكمة عادلة. في هذه المناسبة أنا أود أن أدعو الجميع لربما للنهوض جميعا أمام التحديات التي تعيشها وضعية حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر، ولا نكون صوت واحد من أجل إعلام صوت الحق، صوت الحقوق والحريات والدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر.
Thank you, Rachid. Are there any questions? Doesn't seem we have any questions so far.
السؤال بالعربي في مترجم يعني. مرحبا بالجميع.
No. I don't think there are any questions. So I'll move forward. I would like to thank again our speakers for sharing their expertise and for their valuable contributions. I want to thank Rachid, Nadège, Estelle, and Yassin. To summarize what we have talked, there is a question. I see someone raised their hand. Go ahead.
مساء الخير لكم جميعا. أولا نشكر منظمة شعاع والمساهمين معها في هذا الندوة التي نعتبرها مهمة جدا، يعني بمناسبة اليوم العالمي لحقوق الإنسان. مشكورون جدا على مجهودكم. فقط أردت أن أضيف أنه ضروري أن نكثف من هذا النوع من النشاطات، خاصة في جانبه التوعوي، في جانبه تلقين الأفراد حقوقهم من الجانب القانوني بالنظر إلى القانون الجزائري الداخلي، ثم بالنظر كذلك إلى القوانين الدولية. لما نعرف حقوقنا داخليا وكذلك نعرف حقوقنا على المستوى الدولي، ربما نجد شيء من الشجاعة للتحرك رغم وجود المضايقات ورغم وجود ما نتعرض له من ملاحقات. ضروري جدا أن نتعلم أن نتحدى، لأن التحدي وحده فقط يجعلنا نثبت حقنا ونسترجع هذا الحق. أتحدث ربما بحكم أننا نحن في عائلات المختطفين قسرا حاولنا قدر الإمكان أن نفرض هذا المنطق بغض النظر على الملاحقات اللي كنا نعيشها قبل سنوات، المتابعات، المضايقات في وقفاتنا إلى غير ذلك، لكن ضرورة الإصرار والصمود والثبات هي العنوان الأساسي والعنوان الأبرز في أي نشاط حقوقي. نفهم جيدا أن التنظيمات أو المنظمات أو الدول التي تخضع للحكم الاستبدادي لن تسهل المهام، وبالتالي علينا أن نتسلح بشيء من الشجاعة ولكن كذلك بشيء من المعرفة في حقوقنا، قوانيننا الداخلية وكذلك الدولية. هذه فقط النقطة التي أحببت المشاركة بها. شكرا لكم.
شكرا وسيلة على الإضافة متاعك. Do you have any other questions or observations? I will summarize now what you have talked about. So we talked today about the arrest of political activists and their harassment, freedom of assembly, peaceful assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression. We've talked about the shutting down of civic space, the arbitrary suspension of parties, media outlets, and association. We've talked about travel bans and the misuse of counterterrorism laws to silence activists and human rights defenders, and the unlawful searches conducted by the Algerian authorities. We also talked about the legal framework being used to target activists, human rights defenders, and lawyers, and to shut down peaceful activism. We've talked about the human rights lawyers who face today harassment and arrests, and they are and the amendment of many provisions of the penal code, such as articles and provision related to foreign funding and counterterrorism laws with their vague expression in defining terrorism. Also, the statement of UN special rapporteurs, like the special rapporteur on terrorism, the special rapporteur on freedom of assembly and association, and rapporteur on human rights defenders. And also the targeting of human rights defender in relation to the Iraq movement, and the right to fair trials and the obstruction in their work and denial of fair trials. So if you have any other questions? If not, I would like to thank our speakers for their rich contributions. And also I want to thank
المتحدثين إذا عندهم إضافة.
Yes, if one of the speakers have any additions and want to speak about other problems and issues. Yassin or Nadège or Estelle, do you have? Yes,
Yes, Imana, I have a quick intervention. One that comes from a more personal point of view, that from my own background, being African, Middle Eastern, when we consider and think about Algeria, we think of them as the revolutionaries in our midst. I think the revolutionary and the aspirations towards greater freedoms is something that has been growing very strongly in Algeria since colonialism, since independence, and that this aspiration is still moving strong. And then I think it's part of the tapestry of Algeria, and that it's still part of the story towards achieving these greater freedoms. So even when there's obstacles and hitches on the road, that it's still a much longer story that's being told, and we should not be swayed and dissuaded by that. When we look at the situation in Syria, Gaza, especially in Gaza, Sudan, especially considering the recent events in Syria, where there's been such an arduous and long road towards the realization of freedoms, and it can happen. It's just that it's understanding that it's a long walk. It's a long walk to reach there, and there are lots of people in the state that are working towards this. And yeah, it's just a point of admiration for the Algerian people, and that you are not alone in this fight, and that there are many that share the same vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Yassin. I see someone who wants to ask a question. You can unmute. نرى إنه فما شكون من الحاضرين عنده سؤال يمكنكم التكلم. فما إضافة.
I hope that it's me that you're speaking to. This is Tara O'Grady. Am I right that I have the floor?
Yes, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. So my organization is called No Peace Without Justice. I'm based in Ireland. We have offices in Rome and in Brussels, and we do work internationally. I've just returned from the Assembly for States Parties at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where I was working last week. And I want to echo what Yassin has just said, because Algeria is known as a revolutionary country, whom Ireland has great respect for. And as you know, some of you may know that the Irish people had 800 years of occupation, very brutal occupation, where they tried to take not only our identity and our culture and our food, which fed the British wars of colonialism, they also took our language. We have had a revival of love for our language in the last few years. And we have made and established our tiny little island as a place amongst nations, I think, because of the role that we played in fighting against colonialism and being determined not to give up, to express our desire to be respected, to maintain our dignity, and to fight for human rights also for other nations and for other peoples and cultures, regardless of their religion or their creed. Some of you I see from your profiles have studied in Ireland, and some of you indeed live here. We are not forgetting the Algerian people. Every time I see something about Algeria or I meet someone from Algeria, I think of what France did in your country. And um, I'm I'm excited to see so many people engaged, to see the resistance that you're showing to the world. Um, I implore upon you not to lose heart. We're living in the most difficult times, certainly in my lifetime. I was very glad to see the arrest warrants for certainly for the Israeli perpetrators of crimes against humanity, and to see them so clearly outside the World Forum in The Hague, that their Amnesty International had a picture of Netanyahu outside, saying that no one is beneath the rule of law. And although there was a van that was parked outside, Amnesty has a van at The Hague that has billboards on both sides, and the security and the police forced Amnesty to take the van away. Amnesty contacted the mayor's office, and the mayor said, of course, that Amnesty were within their rights to have this display, and the van was brought back with Netanyahu's face on it for the entire week. Now, if that can happen, and yes, it is, in fairness, it is a small comfort to anybody, particularly those who are under the boot of oppression in Gaza and Lebanon by the Israelis, and now also in Syria. It's a small comfort, but there are methods of progress through the rule of law, and I implore you to continue and not to lose heart in what you're doing, to mobilize through civil society, because our strength is only in each other, through the trade unions, through colleges where you can, as Amnesty are so wonderful at doing, to give talks to build awareness for your cause in Algeria. And there is a bright future just beyond grasp. But I send my solidarity to those of you with family members who have been arbitrarily detained, who have been disappeared, who have spent years in prison, not to see your loved ones and hold them close to you. And my heart breaks for that for you. So I just want to give you the tiny scrap of encouragement that I can from Ireland. Your voices are not being cried out into the wilderness. You are being heard. Thank you for the work that you're doing, because it also encourages those of us who are outside and feel very isolated too. But you have not disappeared. You are on the radar. Human rights are for all of us, and the rule of law is for all of us. And there will be justice for you in Algeria. Thank you for allowing me to have the floor.
Thank you, Tara, for this contribution. If anyone else has a question or want to contribute with their perspective and expertise, anyone else? I don't see anyone else raising their hand. So I will conclude with thanking our panelists again. I also want to thank our attendees for joining us and for your thoughtful contributions and questions. Okay. رشيد، ثم شكون يحب يزيد إضافة؟
مصطفى بن جامعة أعتقد. تفضل مصطفى.
مصطفى بن جامعة، تفضل. مصطفى، يمكنك التحدث أو تقديم أي إضافة.
تفضل مصطفى.
رشيد على هذا الاجتماع القيم، إلا أنه ما عندي حتى إضافة على وش قلته شكرا.
Okay. Anyone else? I don't see anyone else with a question.
طيب فقط
رشيد.
كان في بعض الإشارة وأسئلة هنا حول المضربين على الطعام. أعتقد أني أنا تكلمت على الموضوع تاع المضربين على الطعام في سجن القليعة، وكذلك حتى في سجن الحراش. مع الأسف الشديد كان فيه إضراب دخلوا فيه 18 ناشط معتقل رأي وناشط سياسي في سجن القليعة يوم 6 نوفمبر، لكن السلطات من أجل ربما إيقاف أو الضغط على المضربين على الطعام تم تحويل البعض منهم إلى سجن الحراش، وكان دخولهم في إضراب عن الطعام هو من الاحتجاج على اعتقالهم التعسفي وعلى إطالة ربما إطالة عدم إطالة الحبس الاحتياطي وعدم مثولهم أمام المحاكمة. كذلك فيه ناشط مصطفى قيرة، كذلك هو دخل في إضراب الآن أكثر من قرابة الآن 43 يوم في إضراب عن الطعام. كل هذه يعني هي كل هذه الأصوات هم يعبروا على، أعتقد هم أكثر صورة أو أكثر يعني وضوح حول الوضع الحقوقي في الجزائر، وحول التضييق أو قمع الأصوات التي تمارس حقها في حرية التعبير أو تطالب بحقها في الحرية والعدالة والمساواة والمطالبة بالديمقراطية وسيادة القانون. أنا من جهتي أعيد أشكر كل المتحدثين وأشكر المشاركين معنا في هذه المناسبة، وأذكر دائما دورنا ومسؤولياتنا جميعا من أجل الوقوف أو من أجل الدفع أو من أجل تعزيز مفهوم أو مبادئ حقوق الإنسان في الجزائر وفي العالم أجمع، وستكون لنا فرص أخرى من أجل تسليط الضوء على واقع الحقوق والحريات في الجزائر. شكرا جزيلا مرة ثانية.
شكرا رشيد. I want to thank our speakers again and thank our attendees for joining us today in this webinar. I encourage everyone to continue the conversation beyond this webinar and share today's insights and advocate for change in Algeria. So thank you all again, and I hope to see you at future events. And I wish you a happy evening.
شكرا.
Everyone.
Thank you, Imène.
Thank you.